Well, thank you for joining this talk. My name's Kathryn Friedlander, and I'm going to be talking about imaginative cognition in creative expertise. So this talk was originally given as a keynote speech for the BPS Cognitive Section in August 2025. And it's actually going to be published as an article in the Cognitive Psychology Bulletin in January 2026. Just to draw your attention also to my book, which was published by Taylor and Francis in 2024 on the psychology of creative performance and expertise. And that's actually what the talk today is. There's the area that this talk falls in creativity and expertise, particularly in performance areas. So the theme of the talk is imaginative cognition, and in particular, the role of mental imagery within creative domains. So my aim today is to suggest that mental imagery is one promising but underexplored avenue for understanding expertise in applied creative domains. And I'll highlight some directions where cognitive science could make real contributions. So if we're going to talk about creative expertise, a lot of people sort of say, well, are experts creative? So when we think about expertise, we often picture reliability. So a golfer who gets the ball on the fairway every time, or the chess player who knows all the openings. But when we come to the arts, we come a bit unstuck. This is Steve Ellisnis down here playing the cello, and I don't go to see him. I love Steve Ellisnis, but I don't go to see whether he can remember the notes or he can hit the notes. I go for something slightly different. And we don't go to see maybe a play of Shakespeare to see whether the actors remember their lines. So it's not reliability, it's not even accuracy. So what we're actually looking for is an aesthetic payoff, an emotional and moving experience, and reliability really isn't capturing the whole story. Now, if you look at the expertise literature, that's what they're focusing on. They're focusing on reliability. You may have perhaps heard of the 10,000-hour view that, or 10-year rule, that all we need to become expert in the domain is practice, practice, practice. And that shapes the paradigms, the methods we've used to explore expertise in cognitive psychology. We're testing whether musicians can replicate performance reliably. Maybe you get them into the lab and ask, well, play this tune, and then 20 minutes later play it again and see if they can do it exactly, or can they sight read accurately? And so it's largely constricted our research to areas such as chess and sport and elite classical music, where practice is really very heavy. And there's been a focus on this role of practice, 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 with other people saying, no, there's aptitude as well. And we've got ourselves entrenched in a nature-nurture debate, which has been really rather unhelpful. So I would argue actually that creativity is implied in expert performance. If you think about Tolstoy, for example, the author Tolstoy, I mean, maybe he's an expert. He certainly wrote a novel that people are still reading even today. So if he published it once, but then you say, well, can you be reliable? And he publishes the same novel again, and then the same novel again. You can see that doesn't work. You can't also, if you were Vermeer, you can't paint the girl with the pearl earring and then paint it again and paint it again. And over on the far side over here, this is one of my articles. So even for a scientist, I've published this article in Frontiers, but if I were then to take it and publish it in another journal and then another journal, it's the identical, reliable article. I'd be asked to retract at least two of these. Because when we produce something, we can't just replicate it time and time again. The expectation is that when we produce something else, it's going to be different, it's going to be new, and that implies creativity. So I would argue there is creativity in the performing arts, in particular at the high end of that spectrum. Cognitive psychology often approaches the study of creativity through a problem-solving lens, and the way that we define creativity is often through two aspects, one of novelty and originality. And what I was just arguing, it's got to be new to history, not just new to me, but new to history. If you're going to be a major contributor, someone like Mozart or Darwin, for example. So a new theory or a new solution, a new problem solving, or a brand new art form that's never been seen before, particularly if you're going to be a household name that's remembered for something really quite striking. And the other way that cognitive psychology defines creativity is by appropriateness or utility. It's got to be a sort of adaptive or at least appropriate. You can't just say, well, sit 100 chimpanzees with a typewriter in a room and have them type. What they will type will be never have been seen before, but it won't be useful. What is that? It's just some typed letters. So it's got to fit the bill or solve a problem or be appropriate in some way. And that's again where cognitive psychology says, well, the performing arts, are they useful? What use is a dance? But again, we could counter that by saying, well, no, dance is creative because it can be a means of communicating a message or a way to achieve authentic expression to satisfy an artist's need to create. Another angle on this as well is who is creative in the arts. So a lot of people will accept that the original producer of an artwork, so the painter or sculptor of original artwork, the writer, the playwright, the screenwriter of a written work, or maybe the composer or choreographer of a musical art form, they're easily recognizable as being creative. Um, and I suppose what we also want to nod at here is that expertise in the domain is key for these people as well. They need to have what I've called in my book an architectonic understanding for significant achievement. They've got to be aware of the genre, the period, the materials, and the cultural context in which they are working. But when we come to the performers, a lot of cognitive psychologists are a little more reluctant to say that they are creative. A lot of people will say, oh, performers aren't creative. They're just replicating. They're given the score. They're given the script. They're just performing it. Why are they creative? So a lot of people will argue this. It's just limited to interpretation, so it's not true creativity. And Thompson and Jake have said that, well, actually, that's why creativity is an underexplored area of artistic performance. We only study how good they are in terms of replication. We're not really looking at their creativity because there's been this misguided belief that performers are mere replicators and that only composers and improvisers are the true generators. So Tannenbaum argued against this. He said that execution was important, that many performers are creative, soloists or ensembles that bring a distinctive interpretation to a work, or that could be less so for rank and file orchestra members, for example, who will be just playing the piece under the direction of the conductor, who may have the creative vision. And he points out that even people who produce things, so the actual producers of exquisite works, can actually be replicators. They don't have to be that original. So if you think about traditional furniture makers or restorers of cathedral stonework, or even forgers of great art, what the forgers produce is exquisite. It may look very, very similar to the original, but it wasn't their idea. They're not the first one to do it. So all in all, I would argue that we have actually come a long way since the 10,000 hours rule. During these like 2010 to 2020, there's a lot of work saying, no, could we move away from it just being a practice or aptitudes argument? So we do have aptitudes over here, and we do have the quality of practice here, but there are multifactorial models. This happens to be from my book, multifactorial models of how we get from the attitudes that we start off with to skill performance at the other side. And there's all sorts of things like our personal qualities, our gender, our ethnicity, the environment we were brought up with, the sort of social support, the economics, could our parents afford to buy a violin, and the opportunity that comes along the way. And I would say that one of the sort of aptitudes is either a hardware sort of aptitude, creativity, or maybe a personal quality, but creativity ought to be amongst some of the things that we consider. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that the neglected areas in creative expert performance might include things like the environment and our gender and luck and opportunity, but also things like awe and our aesthetic responsiveness to art or to an overwhelming, say, beautiful piece of music or a huge cathedral building when you walk into it and you get goosebumps. So that leads to sort of like sensitivity and vulnerability. That might be important as well. And imagination and mental imagery. And that is really the subject of the rest of this talk. So if we think about mental imagery and we ask ourselves, well, what is mental imagery? The basic it's the ability to generate a perceptual or motor experience within our mind in the absence of an external input. So what's most commonly studied are auditory and visual modalities. So earworms, where you just, you get a tune in your head. It's not playing in the room. It's not there for real, but you can't stop a tune playing in your head. For me, it's Barbie Girl. Barbie Girl. If somebody starts playing Barbie Girl, I'd be playing it for a week. I've probably set it off now by mentioning it. But we can get pictures in the mind as well. We can actually imagine there's a scene or a person in our mind. And there are some people who actually can't do this. So we can study aphantasia as well. These are people who cannot conjure images in the mind. But other modalities can be invoked as well. So we can actually generate in our mind the impression that we are smelling something. We can think, what does mint smell like? And we can almost get that smell in our head, and taste and touch, bodily sensation and emotional feeling. And indeed, there's the Plymouth Sensory Imagery Questionnaire by Andrade that asks questions on all of these modalities, including auditory and visual. Now, cognitive psychology has had a fascination with visual imagery for, 150 years. But what they're tending to think about is the sort of nuts and bolts, the mechanics. What they're asking, is it really a true to life picture in our head, or do we just think it is? Is it just a fact that we know? So that's been a very long-standing debate. And it's been resolved really with the use of cognitive neuroscience. We can put people in scanners nowadays and ask them to imagine things, and we can see that the imagery is actually showing the same pathways as we would use if we were having a real sight of something, or really hearing that tune, which is fascinating. Our brain is actually triggering the same pathways in our mind. And cognitive psychology has done other things like the limited capacity of visual imagery. How many objects can we imagine at the same time? It's quite limited. And can we resolve an ambiguous image in our mind? I mean, this is a very famous image. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? And when it's drawn on a page, we can kind of flip that image. Sometimes we see a rabbit, sometimes we see a duck. But we have very great difficulty imagining that picture in our head and doing the same flipping backwards and forwards. And cognitive psychology has developed tools for measuring how vivid it is, how vivid this mental imagery is. For example, the measurement of visual imagery, which is concentrating on the brightness of the image's colors in our mind and the sharpness of the outline and the details. It tends to be a bit fuzzier than real life sort of vision. So we're looking at how dynamic and vigorous and alive the image is. And that's what cognitive psychology has been focused on. In the expertise field, we also look at mental imagery, in the terms of mental rehearsal for expertise development. And in fact, one of the other lecturers at the university, Philip Fine, one of my colleagues, wrote an excellent paper in 2015 where he reviewed the use of auditory and visual, motor, emotional, and situational imagery to support mental practice. So, for example, we might play a tune back. If you're a violinist in bed at night without a violin in our hands, we might see our fingers sort of on the fingerboard, or we might hear the notes that we want to play and add sort of a lean or a nuance here and there, or some rubato. So we can do this, and it does support expert performance. And the whole area of visualization in sports performance is a powerful illustration of where mental imagery is put to use in promoting sort of expert performance. But imagination is wider than this. And Anna Abraham in 2016 drew up what she called a neurophilosophical five-part framework of the imagination, which is focusing on broader applications of mental imagery. We do get some very sort of basic mental imagery like mental rotation and playing earworms in our head. And we can sort of think about imagination in terms of dreams and hypnosis, things like this. We can look at the phenomenology, so that aesthetic engagement, those goosebumps when we listen to music. But what I want to focus on particularly is over here the intentionality, which is the mental state reasoning or theory of mind, mental time travel, autobiographical and episodic memory, and novel combinatorial uses of imagery, by which, particularly visual imagery, by which I'm thinking creativity and hypothetical reasoning, counterfactual thinking, and hypothesis generation. And I'm going to go through these over the next few slides. So when we're talking about visual imagery, vividness and creativity, we might well presuppose, it's perfectly intuitive to suppose that creativity involves imagination. It sounds intuitively plausible. I mean, do vivid imaginers make more creative people? And anecdotes say that many important creative moments have been accompanied by visual imagery vividness. So Einstein, for example, and Kekulé and Coleridge. But the literature has actually found very weak links between mental imagery and creativity, and that puzzled us. Why might that be the case? Well, one reason might be that we're trying to find this link through an association between the VVIQ, the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire by Marx, and traditional lab-based divergent thinking tasks such as the alternative uses task or the Torrance test of creativity. So I'm going to go and have a little look at this questionnaire over the next few slides. Marx's Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, the VVIQ, assumes that mental imagery is unidimensional. All we have to think about is how clear or how lively is the image. But actually, people have questioned that. Visual imagery isn't unidimensional. There are various components in it. Blaženkova and Kozhevnikov, some time ago now, proposed that actually there was a difference between objects and spatial imagery, and they developed the OSIVQ, the Object Spatial Imagery and Verbal Questionnaire. So they're suggesting that object imagery might be stronger for those with artistic creativity. That relies on the what pathway. The what pathway in one's mind does things like color and texture and the sort of, yes, the vividness and brightness of the image. Whereas the where pathway, the spatial pathway, which goes up the back of our brain, that actually enables us to do mental rotation. And that might lead to scientific creativity. So certainly for engineering, sort of imagining components in three-dimensional space. And Mayer more recently distinguished between proximal imagery, so imagery like, well, can you imagine going shopping? The frontage of Tesco's or something like that, making a cup of coffee, recalling your next door neighbor. And these questions are very like the questions of the VVIQ. They're fairly boring. It's everyday life. It's just, can you remember the sort of what it looks like to do that kind of thing? Whereas they thought that was also distal imagery. So what it might be like to live in the next century or at the bottom of the ocean and start imagining what does not exist. So I and a number of colleagues put a paper together in 2022 that pulled all these things together. We said along the spatial pathway, we might well have both rather boring mental rotation and rather exciting novel combinatorial or inventive ways of using spatial imagery. And down here on an object pathway, well, there might be rather boring everyday recall of, going shopping and people and things. And there might be some who have a very vibrant recall of a particular color or shade or texture. But more interestingly, there might be these things over here, like scene development and storyboarding, fantasy and paracosm, which I'm going to talk about in the next few slides, and conceptual expansion. So counterfactual, creative, generative ideas that break the rules of what we know exists in the world today. So I'm going to go through these areas over the next few slides. But what it means is we say that visual imagery isn't unidimensional, and perhaps what we need to look at are the more conceptual and distant elements of the imagery, not those proximal, rather boring, concrete elements, which are the ones captured by the VVIQ. So those light bulb areas in my previous diagram. And then there's also an opportunity, which I'm going to do in the next few slides, to sort of hypothesize about how that might apply to expertise areas as well. So if we think about mental storyboarding, this would be a more distal use of object imagery, and it might be akin to physical storyboarding in films, where they actually put the stories. These are the storyboards for the film Apocalypse Now. They actually, before they did the film, they drew these images so that everybody would know, the director, the casting director, etc., would know the kind of thing they were aiming for in terms of colors and feeling of the film. So maybe in our head, we can set up a visual narrative, which sets up like a blueprint, the tone, the mood, the colors, and the intention in our mind as well. So in creative fiction, we might think that's particularly relevant, that we would have this purposeful use of imagination. We might explore new material within the traditional framework of a literary or dramatic composition, but we might be able to imagine, for example, the story arc of where we want the story to go, and character development, what your character looks like, the conversation rhythm, their tone, what do they sound like, their perspective taking, how they might react, how they might look up perhaps and look at another person, their expression on their face, and just the general mise en scène and the atmosphere. So it's pretty likely on a priori grounds that this might be important to people like novelists and scriptwriters and theatre and film directors, that they will be able to construct these stories in the mind, almost as if there's a camera up there, sort of looking at the action. And in fact, we do find if we look at fantasy proneness in fiction writers, we find that they do have this drive to explore rich mental fantasies and alternative realities and inner worlds. We call it imaginary world play, paracosm. And writers even experienced the illusion of independent agency in work by Taylor. They was reported the feeling that the characters were possessing thoughts and words and actions independently from the author. They were so strongly imagined that they thought that they were guiding the script themselves rather than their own mind. And this is a feature of artistically talented populations generally. So dancers and actors and fine arts students also tend to report intense absorption and fantasy proneness and paracosm. And we might think about mind wandering as well. So staring out of the window and dreaming, castles in the air. So spontaneous mind wandering can be a source of creativity as well. It certainly provides inspiration for professional writers and scientists alike. We're disengaging to the real world out there, the actual percepts, to allow our mind to wander around a cognitive landscape of our own. So mental storyboarding could be an interesting new avenue in expertise, particularly in the performing arts. Storyboarding is relevant to acting too. Actors are immersing themselves in their art form. If they follow the school of method acting, Stanislavski, they're supposed to be living the part for real. And this implies an architectonic understanding of the plot, the work, its wider context. They need to read and read and read the text and in their minds infer the motives and intentions and emotion and engage in meaning making and perspective taking. So yes, it's self-referencing, living the part for real. Even some actors generate a backstory for the character that they're playing in order to understand, well, how did they come to be this way? And then we can use mental storyboarding as well to help an actor play the part. So imagining their character, how would they walk or talk or react in this scene? So again, we turn back to mental rehearsal then, the nuances of movement and the imagined states played out in the mind. even the audience can get into the picture as well. The audience can be sucked into the story. It's called adhesion to fiction. We have this willing suspension of disbelief. I mean, in defiance of all sensory evidence and rational logic, we are in the cinema, sitting safely in a seat. We're not in the sea with the shark, but we get this consensus hallucination that if suddenly a shark zooms out at us on projected on the cinema screen, we all scream. We're there. So again, we have this mental simulation of events and characters in motion, a narrowing of focus, which is fully engaging your mental resources in what is playing out in front of you. And sometimes this is accompanied by aesthetic response, goosebumps and shivers, or weeping, leaving the cinema in floods of tears. We've all been there. So it's a feature of many art forms that employ narrative, whether dance, theatre, cinema, fiction, or literature. It can apply when we're looking at a painting. It can apply when we're sucked into music. So if we turn to the other aspect, which is conceptual expansion or counterfactual, creative, generative kind of use of imagination, unlike storyboarding, where we're tending to remain within an existing art form, exploring the what could be engages with creativity as an exploratory and transformational process, crossing boundaries. So it's possibility generation. It's linked to sort of divergent thinking, sort of brainstorming kind of activity, but also what's called conceptual expansion. So conceiving the impossible, more strongly unbounded creative fantasies is really difficult to achieve. In a study by Ward, they asked people to imagine an alien life form, which is completely unlike anything that's on Earth. And a lot of people drew this kind of object that you can see at the side here. It is very unlike something at Earth, but you can see it still is actually symmetrical. It's got legs, it's got eyes, we think, and there's a head at the top of the body. So it's not really conceptual expansion. It's just variation on a theme of what we get on Earth. So there's a general tendency to follow the path of least resistance in line with what we call previous schemas of what we know already. So counterfactual thinking is thinking which is counter to the facts, literally alternative endings to events that have already occurred. What if that had happened? How might it have played out then? Or alternative temporal or spatial or social or hypothetical realities that transcend the here and now, the reality, the logical. An alternative way of approaching artistic creation, for example. And Abraham classifies this under her heading of novel combinatorial thinking. So it's challenging conventional wisdom and existing boundaries, but it's relevant to science too. It's not just the arts. Einstein's famous thought experiment of riding on a beam of light led to the theory of relativity. The idea was if the speed of light, if there's a speed of light, but you ride on a beam of light, does light appear to stand still? That was the puzzle that he was trying to answer in his head. So he was having thought experiments in his head. And this is where big C creativity, so sort of like household name level, people will remember forever, is found. Sort of Bowden is saying that it's the exploration and in most interesting cases, the transformation of conceptual spaces in people's minds. So it's taking art and science to places where it's never been before. Transformational ways of thinking, whether ways of writing prose or poetry, genres of sculpture, painting, or music, theories in chemistry, biology, or mathematics, habits of couture, and systems of choreography. If we think, still staying in STEM, but if we look at the novel combinatorial or inventive, this is using the spatial visualization pathway, and we think about combining things in space, maybe in three-dimensional space, and coming up with something new. This is often tested out via spatial rotation tests that are very proximal functional. You can sort of like, if you rotated this sort of set of cubes, would it look like this one, or would it be a reflection of it? That kind of thing. What we really want to be thinking about is transformational science. So people like Kekulé, his reverie about a snake eating its own tail, he had a dream of this, led to his theory of the structure of the structure of benzene in chemistry. And Feynman's diagrams describing the behavior of some atomic particles began as mental pictures of particles interacting in space-time within his mind. And we might think that spatial visualization might be actually important for expert fields within the film industry. So, for example, directors might need to visualize the scene in 3D before it even happens. So what would the actors be doing? Where would the props be? Where do you want the camera and the movement and the mood? So what's that going to look like in terms of three-dimensional space? So the cinematographers with their picture lenses and angles and heights and the altering of perspective and framing and depth. And people like the editors and the production designers and the special effects, they're all planning shots and sets and edits to change the speed and the impact of the film. And you might well imagine that having good spatial visualization might actually be an advantage. And what about vibrancy? I mentioned that some people might have a particularly strong ability to retain or inspect the detailed image, a particularly vibrant. They might remember a particular shade of pink and be able to go and match it in the paint shop or something like that. So having this sensitivity to and recall of stimuli is proximal. So it's not a distant, but a more sort of everyday skill. But it can be very intense. And object visualizers have a better recall of shape and color and texture. And this may lead, so Korzhevnikov suggests, and also Piechowski, it might lead to more vivid imaginational overexcitability in artist populations. And if we're transferring that to performance or expertise areas, we might associate it with expertise perhaps in clothes design or sewists. Maybe you'd have an enhanced mental recall of texture or color or pattern so that if you happen to see a button, you think, oh, I know that would go amazingly with that material that I have at home. And you'd be able to recall that in your mind. So there's visualizations of possibilities that are both visual and tactile, maybe the sort of a feel of the velvet or corduroy. And that might lead to innovative and vibrant design. So where might we go from here then? I've sort of, I hope, persuaded you by now that visual imagery and other modalities of imagery might be important to those in the performing and creative arts, and even to people in science, in STEM subjects. But what do we need to do? Well, I think one of the main things is we need to have a better measurement tool for visual imagery. As I mentioned before, the VVIQ is measuring things like, can you imagine your next door neighbor? Can you imagine the sun rising over a lake? And these are very proximal, everyday imagery. We need to capture applications which are distal, the ability to imagine what does not yet exist. And we need to distinguish the object and the spatial applications as well. And visual imagery, I think I've argued, may be key in many fields. Writers, designers, sewists, filmmakers, actors, scientists, the list goes on. But visual imagery is very rarely explored in the expertise literature. So I think that we could certainly turn the lens on these areas. It's not just visual imagery. We could also see that other modalities might come to mind as well. I mean, what about gustatory, olfactory, so taste and smell? So chemosensory mental imagery, because that's what we're talking about with taste and smell, actually has been argued by Spence to lead to taste imagination. As I say, can you imagine right now the taste of mint or of chocolate, even if you haven't eaten any? And maybe that's what leads to successful cocktail mixologists, for example. Or what about Heston Blumenthal? Where does he get all his ideas of what taste might go with another taste? Sometimes it's really quite wacky what he combines, and somehow he must know that this is going to work. And we might think about chefs or perfumers. Are they creating new scents through sensory imagery? But this modality is hardly ever studied. That's because probably visual imagery is reported as the strongest modality we have. We have pictures in the mind. A lot of people have pictures in the mind, but people don't tend to report being able to intensely experience an imagined smell or taste in their mind. But still, we do have scales. We have, for example, the vividness of olfactory imagery questionnaire and the vividness of wine imagery questionnaire, which I'm determined to get into my research somewhere, which includes the dimensions of sight, smell, flavor, and mouthfeel, but all within the mind. And another interesting aspect might be aphantasia, because we could explore whether having a lack of mental imagery could actually affect the ability to succeed, particularly in some of these performance areas. The term mental imagery and aphantasia have recently been expanded to cover all modalities. So there's an opportunity to study cases such as Glenn Keane, the Oscar-winning artist behind Disney's The Little Mermaid. He actually is a cartoonist, but when he's starting to draw his cartoons, he doesn't imagine them in his head. He starts to sort of scribble, and he grounds his animations in factual knowledge, and then he does a few scribbles, and then he refines those. But it's building on the page in real time in front of him. He has no mental imagery of where he is going with this design. And KJ Zagabria, who's a children's book author, she actually wrote a blog quite recently where she explained how she uses conscious imagination by deliberately supplying details, things like I'm going to, she has a notebook where she says, well, I think this dwarf or rabbit or whatever is going to have green velvet boots, but she's not imagining this in her mind. So she's using mind maps and lists, mnemonics, tactile materials. So she has like a storyboarding on her wall where she has a pin board where she pins things, and extensive reading. So it's clearly not impossible to be a creative artist without mental imagery, particularly visual imagery. But what we could explore is how costly these workarounds are. And what about acting? Could you really have an actor who can inhabit the part for real, who actually has aphantasia? Would that actually be possible? Could they actually play the part without being able to imagine it in their mind? Finally, I'm going to just have a quick nod to AI because it's all around us now, isn't it? It will continue to develop its capabilities. And AI is very impressive, but it's limited at present because it has the ability, unfortunately, to take what we might call prosy, so creative jobs, professional creative jobs, effortlessly. So people in the design area, photographic, videos, artworks, soundtracks, even screenwriting and script writing, AI is being used all over the place now to do the roles that used to be done by humans. And expertise has taken a knock recently from many sources as well. Content is expected to be free or cheap. Nobody wants to pay for it, and somebody's got to earn a living. And of course, you only have to be on the internet a minute before you see expertise, sort of expert deniers and haters out there in force. So more and more, I think humans are going to turn to AI to say, well, give me a really creative idea for, or what can I do instead of, or even write me a. So instead of using our own mental resources to lie back, stare out of the window and imagine for ourselves, we'll just think, oh, I'll ask ChatGPT to supply me with the next storyline. I won't generate it in my mind. So what might we lose? When we imagine vividly in our mind, as with those story writers who could imagine, the script in front of them, the sensory and emotional systems in the brain activate. Authors of novels actually, as they write their novels, sometimes they can be reduced to tears or have goosebumps of their own as they write the words from their own mind on their page. Their emotional systems are jangling. They're experiencing the sensation. It is weaker, but it is authentic. but not if we're supplied with an off-the-shelf solution. If ChatGPT just gives us the line, well, we'll think, oh, that's okay. But it's a kind of like, duh, not an aha moment, but a yeah, okay, well, we could do that. And it's not generating the same emotional buy-in and engagement from us. Now, creativity thrives on playfulness and curiosity and associative leaps that at the moment only humans can do. We can plan and recombine and knowingly disrupt. We can run thought experiments like Einstein in our minds. Now, the trouble with AI is it's built on pattern prediction. It recombines, it does not disrupt. So what we do when we ask it to produce a script is we risk replacing genuine sort of like counterfactual thinking with safe, averaged pastiche. So what I would argue is that AI is not a creative producer; it's a replicator. It's a forger, really. It's like the forger of those paintings I mentioned earlier. However brilliant the script, however brilliant the piece of music, it has been scraped from the work of others and it is simply recombining the notes. So if we outsource imagination to AI, will our creative range regress towards the norm? And will we lose the taste for just looking out of the window and innovating ourselves? What I would be going to conclude with this thought: if we hand over the work of imagining to AI, we risk becoming performers of somebody else's very mediocre script and of losing the very mental play that makes human creativity exceptional. And you'll also find a write-up of this talk on the Create Sci blog, which features a wide range of research by myself and my colleagues at the University of Buckingham. So once again, thank you very much for joining me on this talk, and I do hope you enjoyed it.